I'm glad that I'm able to speak here in this university. I just heard that you have the unique situation of having only graduate students. That's a dream of all professors, to have only graduate students. So I also teach only graduate students, but that is just my own privilege. Most of the universities in Spain, of course, have students from the first year. I'm glad that I'll be able to speak about my current research. And my current research is about discourse and knowledge. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. But for those of you who don't know how I came to this topic of discourse and knowledge, maybe in a few minutes I give you a summary where I come from. That is important. I started my work many, many years ago, more than 40 years ago, in French language and literature. My first studies were on French surrealist poetry, which have little to do what I'm going to do today, but at least that taught me how to take text seriously, to look at each word, to look at discourse with lots of details. And then more and more within literary theory, I wanted to be much more explicit. And we, in those times, in the 1960s, we were all influenced by Chomsky, or as you know it, Chomsky, namely to have a more explicit theory of literature. But in those times, linguistic grammars, as you know, were only sentence grammars. And in order to describe poetry in a more systematic way, of course, you needed a linguistics of text. In those times, we didn't have that, so my first more serious work was in my dissertation more than 40 years ago on text grammar. So I started my work on discourse in linguistics doing text grammar. But the interesting thing is that in order to talk about many aspects of texts, one also needs cognition. One also needs things which have to do with text coherence. And much of text coherence is not specifically in the text itself, but it has to do with mental representations. So that's why in those times I more and more was interested to establish the basis for some kinds of discourse structures, for example, macro structures, which you could not actually observe in a text. General topics. General meaning, global meanings, you can only, and I could only explain in psychological terms. So I established a relationship with a North American psychologist, Walter Kintsch, and we worked together for many years, and we finally produced, more than 30 years ago, a book called Strategies of Discourse Comprehension. And that book has been of influence in psychology as a basic book to understand how people produce and how they understand discourse. So what I'm going to do today about discourse and knowledge ultimately goes back to the work I have done 30 years ago on the psychology of discourse comprehension. All right? But then in the 1980s, I discovered that we had more and more about the structures of discourse. We had slowly more and more about the structures of the mind in which are relevant to produce and understand discourse, but there was a third dimension missing. And the third dimension is, of course, society. So in order to understand the full impact of discourse, we not only need discourse structures, and we not only need mental structures, we also need social structures. So as from the 1980s and more, I was interested also to study social issues like, for example, racism. So with my students in Amsterdam and then later also in California, I was interested in racism. I was interested in how discourse is involved in the production and reproduction of racism in society. And that aspect of racism is done within the broader field of what we now call critical discourse analysis. And critical discourse analysis basically is committed discourse analysis. It is not a method, it is some kind of perspective, it's some kind of attitude of doing socially and politically committed research with the help of discourse analysis. So what I was interested in is how ethnic prejudice, ethnic and racist ideologies are produced and reproduced through discourse. So what I told in Moscow the other day is that my current framework always has 3 dimensions. 1, to systematically and explicitly describe discourse structures at all levels. Semantic, syntactic, pragmatic, argumentative, narrative, all dimensions of discourse, many. First task of discourse analyst is to be able to describe text and talk. The second task is very important, namely that these discourses have a role in society, for example, in the production and the reproduction of power, power abuse and domination. So most people in critical discourse analysis study the relationship between discourse structures and social structures of domination, inequality, power, organizations, groups, and so on. 2 major dimensions of the critical study of discourse. But many of my colleagues in critical discourse analysis, because they are so much focused on micro-sociology of interaction, or macro-sociology of racism and systems of domination, that they forget the crucial interface, namely the cognitive interface. You can only relate discourse to society through the mind of participants, through the mind of language users. There is no direct relationship between social structure and how people speak or how they understand. You always need a mental cognitive interface. So that's why my system, which is the background for me today, also for you, is always these 3 dimensions. Yes, discourse structures, yes, social structures, and especially also a very detailed analysis of the cognitive structures, which are the interface between discourse and society. Now, that I did for many years, so within this framework of the critical analysis of discourse, I was not only interested in power and racism, but I also started with a program of focusing on things which in many disciplines might have been treated, for example in political science, for example ideology. So if you see the study of ideology for more than 100 years, from Marx, Lenin, through Mannheim, through Lukács, and so on until today, Althusser in France, most of these studies of ideology are more philosophical. They don't see ideologies as systems of ideas, and especially how they are organized in the mind of people. So in my book more than 10 years ago, which maybe one day is translated into Russian, called Ideology, I established a study of the social cognition related to discourse. But I'm not going to talk about ideology today, but afterwards in questions we can see whether we talk about it. Next of studying ideologies, I also was interested more and more not only in the study of text structure itself, but also in context. So today, in my last books called Discourse and Context and Society and Discourse, published a few years ago by Cambridge University Press, I propose a new theory of context, and it says the following. They say, for example, in social linguistics, we know that discourse and language use varies with social parameters like ethnicity, age, social class, and many other things. Standard social linguistics. Unfortunately, it is wrong. Discourse, language use does not vary directly with social structure because there is no relationship between social structure and language use. Again, what they were forgetting is there is a cognitive interface. It is not objective social structures which have an influence on language. What has an influence on language is our definition of the social structure, the subjective definition of the participants of the social situation, of the communicative situation, that has an influence on how we speak. Again, context is not out there. Context is in here. Context is a mental model of the communicative situation. What for people is relevant At this moment I'm speaking to you as a discourse analyst. Objectively speaking, I am also Dutch, I'm also a man, I also am a grandfather. All objective properties of me speaking. But relevant here is only that I am a discourse analyst. And maybe a professor, but not much more. So within the context, there is only a fragment of the social situation. So a context is not an objective social situation of communication. It is a mental, subjective mental model of the communicative situation. For each of you, you have a slightly different mental model of this situation. Each of you has different knowledge, different aims, different personal history. For each of you, you will understand my talk in slightly different ways. That's the context. That is why people in the same situation all talk in a different way. Although they are in the same situation, they are even in the same social situation. When I did my fieldwork in Amsterdam and California about how people speak about immigrants, even in the same neighborhood, with the same social situation, each of them spoke in a different way. Why? Not only because they have a different mental model of the situation in their neighborhood, in their barrio, but also because they have a different mental model of the communicative situation. So, speech, language use, discourse varies as a function of context, but the context is a subjective mental model of the communicative situation. Now, this notion of a mental model is crucial for what I'm going to do today. To understand the notion of relationship with discourse and knowledge, I am using this notion of context as a theoretical entrance. Why? As you know, context and language has to do with pragmatics. If you want to speak not only correctly, you have to have grammatical sentences anyway. That's syntax. Not only it has to be meaningful, semantics. Not only it has to refer to things we know about, referential semantics, but also discourse has to be appropriate, as we learned from John Searle and Speech Act many years ago, and then from Grice and many other people already 30, 40 years ago. You all know about that. But the fundamental notion of pragmatics is context. And since that context is not out there, but in here, the appropriateness of discourse depends on my definition of the communicative situation, which is a subjective mental model in my mind. Actually, for psychologists among you, it's part of long-term memory. And in long-term memory, there's a specific section, so to speak. It's called episodic memory. Episodic memory is where you store all your personal experiences. So what you did this morning is part in your mind, in part of the episodic, or also called autobiographical memory, and there you have mental models of all the experiences of your everyday life. So if you tell her afterwards what you did this morning, you activate the mental model of what you did this morning. It's a subjective man, it's yours, with your own emotions, your own opinions, and so you tell it to her, you express in a story a mental model of what happened to you this morning. But the mental model of what happened to you this morning, which is a semantic model, depends on whom you are talking to. So if you had, for example, an accident this morning, obviously you did not. If you had this accident this morning, telling to her, you tell a totally different story than when you, for example, tell the same story to the police. So the same mental model of the event, a semantic, is only adequate when you tell it to her in this way and when you tell it to the police in another way. So it depends on your construction of the communicative situation. Talking to the police gives you a different constraint on talking to a friend. So context takes the mental model of an event and makes it adequate to the communicative situation. And that is what pragmatics is all about. It is appropriateness, all right? Now we come to what we are going to do today. A mental model is relatively simple. Why is that? Because you have to have a mental model and it controls what you speak at each moment. There is no time to have a complete analysis of all these dimensions. It's too complicated. You only have to take into account what at this moment is relevant. So there are many things here. The color of the walls have no influence on what I say, so that is not a relevant dimension. But the fact that you are students and professors in St. Petersburg with knowledge of linguistics and the social sciences is relevant, because I can then presuppose what you know. So relevant is the time and the place. Here, for deictic expression, in lexical expression, I say here, it means here in this room, here in this university, here in this city, here in this country. All these indexical expressions are interpreted in relation to the context model which control what I'm saying. The same with time. Now, today at 5:30 and so on, it controls these kind of things. So part of the mental model is time, place, participants, different kinds of participants and their roles and identities, professors, students, and aims, and the act of giving a lecture. And now comes the new thing, for me at least. Context models not only have all these dimensions I just mentioned, and we already knew about them from less formal work, but crucial in a mental model is also the following. There is a special device controlling knowledge. What I call a K device, a knowledge device. You can call it an epistemic machine. There is in my mental model of the communicative situation an epistemic machine. Why is that so relevant? For appropriateness. It is relevant for appropriateness because each word I use, each thing I say should be adapted to what I think your knowledge is. Of course. If I keep telling you things you as professors and graduate students you know already, it would be totally inappropriate. If I would keep saying things in areas no one would understand, it would also be inappropriate. So one of the crucial things of all discourse is that it is epistemically appropriate to the situation. Now, how can that be? I have to know what you know. Can I look in your brain, in your mind? No. So I need some kind of theory of other minds, as we know from psychology, philosophy, and so on. I need to know what's in your mind in order to talk in an appropriate way here. So part of the mental model of the communicative situation is that I know more or less what you know. How do I know? Well, for example, because most of you are member of the same epistemic community of linguists, anthropologists, and so on. I simply assume that with your education you have learned about many things which I can simply take for granted, which I can simply presuppose. Now we get already notions which link knowledge and discourse, namely implication, presupposition. I can presuppose specific kinds of information which I think you already have. You read a newspaper article and the journalist presupposes lots of information about Russia, about the present, about international affairs, and many things as well. So you read 2 days ago in the newspaper, or yesterday, that there was an explosion, a bomb attack in Boston, and the newspaper doesn't have to say, Boston is a city in the United States. You all know that, and you also know that it's not just washing powder. You know that it's a city. The newspaper doesn't have to explain because the journalist assumes that you know so already. So discourse written in a newspaper or any kind of discourse in everyday conversations systematically presupposes that you know many things. So when I now start to speak about the fundamental notion of discourse and knowledge, it is part of the pragmatic approach of discourse. Why? Because in our context models we have a knowledge machine, an epistemic machine, which constantly, by all kinds of complex mental strategies, adapts what I say to what I think. That's the mental model, is what is subjective. What I think you know, I may be mistaken. And people are mistaken constantly. People tell very often things to other people, what they know already, and people say, I know that already. Or when you doubt, you say, didn't I tell you yesterday about this guy so-and-so? And you recall things people might have forgotten. Or newspapers will say, for example, as we informed in our yesterday edition, and people recall things which people might have not seen or forgotten of yesterday. So there are all kinds of discursive strategies which somehow manage the knowledge of speaker in discourse. Now, we get closer and closer to our topic, by this way of talking about things which don't look like talking about knowledge, namely context, which seem very far away. Now we are where we are, and in the rest of what I'm going to say, I'm going to summarize, and then we have a debate on how I think discourse and knowledge is related. First of all, of course, we have to motivate a little bit better why this is relevant. Now, it's relevant for two very simple reasons. First of all, most of the knowledge we have about the world, how do we know it? First of all, babies, little children, most of what they learn is by vision, by touching things, and so on. It's by experience. They know that wood is hard, and for example, water is liquid. They don't need to be told. They find out for themselves by experience. But as soon as you talk about knowledge which is not directly related to your everyday experiences, you cannot simply do it by experience, by seeing or touching, not by multimodal experiences. You need discourse. Most of what we know about the world comes through discourse. So we now have already two criteria or foundations of where our knowledge comes from. The first is by everyday experience, by vision, touching, hearing, and so on. It is by all our senses, as we already know 300-400 years ago from the empiricists in philosophy. So the first one. But the second one, which epistemologists very often forget, they mention it, but they sort of go over it, sort of superficially. The second and crucial basis and source of our knowledge is text and talk, communication. We know most things about the world through discourse. And the third major one is the inferences based on these two things. So most of the knowledge we have comes from the inferences we have on the basis of everyday experiences or on the basis of discourse. So the three sources of knowledge: experience, perception, and so on, discourse, and inferences. That's the three major ways we know about the world. Now, so we have two major reasons why to talk about discourse and knowledge, namely, first of all, that most of our knowledge comes through discourse and inferences based on that knowledge. That's the first major reason. The second major reason is the following. Namely, in order to produce and to understand discourse, you need vast amounts of knowledge. You cannot understand text and talk, language use, and so on, without an enormous amount of knowledge. So it's not good enough to only have a grammar. It's not good enough to have only rules of discourse. You need much, much more than just grammar and much more than just discourse rules. In order to be able to produce a discourse, you also need to have and activate a large amount of knowledge about the world, otherwise it doesn't work. People found out more than 30 years ago trying to program computers in artificial intelligence. If you want computers to translate or to simply to produce discourse, they found out that it's not good enough to have a grammar. You also have to program lots of knowledge about the world in that computer, otherwise it simply doesn't work. Why is that? Because texts are like icebergs. A text is like an iceberg because it only gives you the things people don't know yet. But vast amounts of knowledge is not in the text itself. Where is it? Again, it's here. It is because people have all this knowledge in their minds. Reading a text, they activate that knowledge and they construe an interpretation of the text in terms of the text information, which is new, with lots of old information repeated, plus all the inferences of the general knowledge you have in their mind. So an interpretation is much richer than what the text says. It's like the iceberg. So now we also see what it means that discourses have implicit or presupposed information. Most of what the text says is somehow a combination of old and new. But most of the interpretation is not in the text, but again, it's here. It is and has to do with the way people construe the meaning of the text in their minds. All right? So this is the basic function. Now we can, first of all, we now need, after this motivation of studying discourse and knowledge, we have to know what knowledge is in the first place. Now, if we go to philosophy, which has been talking about knowledge for more than 2,000 years, the classical definition of knowledge is justified true beliefs. So, knowledge is some kind of belief. It has to do with what you think about something else. It is what's so-called an intentional, with a T, an intentional idea. It is a representation of what is out there. That is knowledge. And it is also not any kind of belief we have, but it's in a belief which philosophers call true. It is simply somehow which is really the case. Otherwise you would simply call an illusion or a superstition. It is essential for knowledge, for a philosopher, that it is true. That's the second thing. And not only it's by coincidence true. So if you are, for example, I think someone is outside of the door, and you just guess, that's not knowledge. You may be right. It may be true, but it's not really justified. Only when you have evidence, then it's justified. So when you have evidence from observation, experience, discourse, or inference, then it's justified. So knowledge is justified true beliefs. Now I have, and some other philosophers too have, a problem with that. They say that is not so flexible, because people in the old days, in the Middle Ages, had ideas about the structure of the world. For example, that the earth was flat. And for them it was knowledge. For us it's false belief. But for them it not only was knowledge, but it functioned as knowledge. It was also presupposed in public discourse, like any knowledge today. So I have a more relative and more contextual conception of knowledge. It depends on the situation in which you speak. An expert in the lab may say things which outside of the lab is not comprehensible, and will say in less formal terms, and it may within the lab be wrong. So knowledge and truth is relative to the communicative situation, it's contextual, and it is relative to a culture. It is relative to a society, is relative to history. So the notion of knowledge I use, which is more natural, naturalistic, is a more relative, naturalistic approach to knowledge is, it says it is beliefs justified by the knowledge criteria of an epistemic community. And these epistemic communities may have different kind of epistemic criteria. In a scientific context, the criteria are different from everyday situations. All right? And one culture may have in Middle Ages or today, or someone in a village in the Amazon, they may have different epistemic criteria than here in St. Petersburg. So it is relative to the epistemic criteria of an epistemic community. That is what knowledge is all about. It functions for us as knowledge when for us it is true, not necessarily for someone else, or in 500 years. So that's very important. Now, that is the basis of what we are going to do afterwards. So the next chapter, actually what I'm now trying to tell you, is part of a book which I try to finish somewhere maybe next week, after having worked on it for more than 5 years. And it was a very difficult book, but it is essentially multidisciplinary. You cannot talk about discourse and knowledge if you only limit to linguistics or only philosophy. It is a book which has most of the social sciences as chapters. And so the next chapter of the book, after philosophical introduction, is the psychology of discourse. Now, as I said before, we now know since the 1970s in artificial intelligence and cognitive psychology that in order to produce and understand a discourse, you have to activate lots of knowledge about the world. Another thing we learned some 30 years ago is the notion I already mentioned, but I'm now going to explicitly define a little bit better. That's the notion of a mental model. A mental model is a subjective representation in your episodic memory or autobiographical memory of an event. So what you did this morning is in your mind as a mental model. What you tell people about is a mental model of your event. It's subjective, there are emotions and so on. For each of you it's slightly different. It's a mental model. We now know, and that's what we defended in the book with Walter Kintsch, and in the same year, 1983, a famous English psycholinguist called Phil Johnson Laird, wrote a book called Mental Models. So we were totally agreed. He for different reasons than we had, but we both agreed that in order to understand the text, you construe a mental model of the situation the text is about. All right, so it's not the meaning of the text which is only relevant, it is the situation the text is about. It's like extensional, has to do with reference. It is what the text is about, which concerns. So to understand the text, you understand the text. And the text is coherent only when the participants in the communicative situation are able to construe a mental model of that discourse. So now we have a notion, a theoretical notion, which we didn't have before in the 1970s. I wrote several books on text grammar and many other things, and the notion of coherence. We didn't know what it meant. We all know that the text is different from an arbitrary sequence of sentences because the sentences somehow are locally or globally coherent. But there was nothing in linguistics to define notions like coherence. It is not just that the meanings of the individual sentences are related. You cannot simply do it in the traditional linguistic semantics. You cannot do that because it's not good enough. Many texts have no meaning relations between sentences, and some texts do have meaning relations and still are not coherent. So it's not a necessary and not a sufficient condition that discourses have meaning relations between sentences. You need something else. But we didn't have anything else in linguistics at the time, so we had to go and get it from psychology. And psychology talked in terms of mental models of subjective situation. Texts are about the psychology of mental models, brings in the referential aspect, how we think about reality, how we think about things we refer to. So to understand a text is to construe a mental model of the situation the text is about. You know, it's extensional. It is something which is where we refer to. All right, so a newspaper article about the bombing in Boston is coherent when people are able to construe a mental model of that bombing, or that explosion, that terrorist attack. All right, that makes it understandable. Now, to understand a text by construing a mental model of the situation it is all about, the text itself is not good enough, because the text only mentions the things we didn't know yet. So in order to construe a mental model of a text, we also have to activate all this knowledge we have about Boston, about terrorists, about bombings, about explosions, and that as a consequence of explosions people can die. All these things the newspaper doesn't tell you. The newspaper doesn't say bombs can cause death. The newspaper doesn't tell you. The journalist who wrote that newspaper article already presupposes that all of the readers of the newspaper know these kind of things. All right? So most of the knowledge you need to construe a mental model of what happened in Boston is something the readers can supply for themselves, because it's part of the knowledge shared in the epistemic community of which all of them are members. All right? So now we get more and more closer to a fundamental theory of the epistemic analysis of discourse, namely, a discourse is coherent and discourse is interpretable, understandable, when people are able to construe a mental model of the event. And the mental model is not only construed with the information of the text, but also with many, many inferences from the general knowledge people have about the world before they started to read the article in the first place, namely about bombing, Boston, and many other things. So we now see that the interpretation of the text comes from the text itself, with new information, that there was something new, namely a bombing in Boston that particular day, with inferences from knowledge we have about the world, plus, of course, inferences which have to do with the context, namely that it was published in our newspapers today and so on. People simply say, yesterday that and that happened. It doesn't say that it wasn't so much April. So we need also information of the context to complete our information about what happened. All right, so three sources. The text, the context, and general knowledge about the world. And with that thing we construe a mental model of the situation, and we can only do so activating from our long-term memory what we know about the world. So that is very important. So that is the cognitive definition of understanding, and this crucial notion of mental models which explains many, many things. And we now also know that when you read about this all the time in the newspaper, you not only have one mental model of one explosion, you read about terrorism all the time. So you have again and again what people do, they learn, because of reading a newspaper, they learn about terrorism in general. They know about deaths and threats and bombs and many things. How do they know? Because they have one mental model and another, and people generalize. They generalize and they make abstractions, and that is how you learn general knowledge about the world. Your generic knowledge about the world, for example, about terrorism, you get by reading every day, maybe not every day, but often, about terrorism, a text in a newspaper, or see it on television. That is how you generate generic, abstract knowledge about the world. And that same generic knowledge about the world is not only yours, like the mental model, or hers, but is something we share in our community of knowledge, our epistemic community. So as soon as you are a member of that epistemic community, you activate this generalized, generic knowledge to construe a mental model for each new article in the newspaper you read. You see, so you first need general knowledge to understand the text in the newspaper, to construe a mental model, and these mental models can be generalized and abstracted to construe new knowledge about the world. So you see there is, if you like, a dialectic relationship, maybe not a good word in this country, a dialectical relationship between mental models and generic knowledge about the world. And not just knowledge, but I'm not going to talk about today, also ideologies. You also construe ideologies from ideological discourses. That's a different talk, a different lecture for another day. So there's the cognitive psychology of discourse, and we now know in psychology a little bit more about the structure of knowledge. For example, not only that it's generic, that it's some kind organized in terms of abstract relationship of conceptuals. For example, that cars are vehicles. We all know that is like a conceptual abstract knowledge. Or that, for example, penguins are not typical birds. So notions of prototypes, also very important in the history of the theory of knowledge. And today, more and more in psychology, we have some kind of multimodal concept of thinking, of mental models, of knowledge as well. And there's some psychologists in the United States called Larry Barsalou, who proposed that knowledge is multimodal. What you know about a car is not just abstract, like a vehicle and so on. A car is something which is multimodal, represented in our brain. It has visual aspects, what it looks, a typical car like, what it sounds like, how it feels like driving a car, and many other aspects. So it's multimodal. Knowledge about cars is multimodal, at least, and that's my critique of that particular kind of proposal, at least it is true for the individual experiences of cars. But if you share it with many other people, of course that cannot be true, because you may have a car and you know all these kind of things like driving, but she may not have it and only be afraid of the cars which go here on high speed on Nevsky Prospect. That is a different experience. So different experiences does not exclude that you have general knowledge about cars. So it must be more abstract, it must be more generic. It's not just individual experience. It is something you can share in an epistemic community. So I think that yes, knowledge is multimodal, but only for mental models, for what happens to you today. So if you cross Nevsky Prospect and one of these fast cars come to you, that construes a mental model with all these kind of things. Danger maybe and so on. Yes. But the general aspect of car cannot have that, because tomorrow you talk about cars in a very different way and so on. So the general notion is probably more abstract. Now, that is the cognitive psychology of knowledge. And again, I say this knowledge is largely, and that's the relationship for today, it's not just psychology. Most of this knowledge about the world we get through text and talk. That's how people know many things about terrorism and so on. Now, the social psychology, very briefly, and all the disciplines at the end, I will talk about linguistics a little bit more, but the other disciplines I will very quickly because we only have an hour. So the social psychology of discourse is about not just cognition, but it's about social cognition. It is about the cognition we share in communities, groups, and so on. So when I talk about knowledge and social cognition, when I talk about knowledge shared in the epistemic community, obviously I'm talking about the social dimension. It is, how is it that you can have it and you too, and how can you share it? Well, we have to explain in terms of social psychology, for example, that you can tell her things, or that you both read the newspaper or watch television or consult the internet. Somehow we know that we can share kinds of things in social psychology, and not only knowledge, but also ideologies. Many ideologies: feminist, anti-feminist, racist, anti-racist, liberal, neoliberal, and many other ideologies are also shared in not communities. Communities, what you all share. Language, for example, each of you share in the community of the linguistic community of speaking Russian. All right, that's one community, a linguistic community. But you also share in the epistemic community, which you call Russia or St. Petersburg, namely what all people know in this city and what they know more generally in Russia or more generally in Europe and so on. So you're also part of an epistemic community. And social psychology has to do with how this epistemic community is constituted, by what kind of interaction, what kind of communication, everyday conversations, forms of communication, how people acquire and share and normalize the knowledge they have about the world. That's social psychology. And also within social psychology, I distinguish between knowledge and ideology. Ideology is also shared, but it's not justified true beliefs. Ideology is also shared, but it's not justified like knowledge. It's not justified by epistemic criteria. I've seen it. I've concluded it, and so on. It is a different kind of shared. It's because I believe it, like in religious things. So ideologies are also shared beliefs, but not in a community, but in a group. And you call them socialist, feminist, racist, anti-racist, pacifist, and so on. What you share in a group as beliefs, for example, ideologies or specific kind of attitudes, they are aspect of a specific kind of group, not of an epistemic community. So that's the social psychology. The sociology of knowledge, which you all know about because it has a long history in many countries in Europe, also in this country. The sociology of knowledge has to do with what? Very briefly, just one sentence. The sociology of knowledge has to do with epistemic institutions. We all share knowledge in the world, but there are institutions and organizations which has as their main task to do that, namely schools, universities, newspapers, academies, and many other institutions. They have as their main aim, there are many other aims, but main aim to transmit, to share, to normalize, to test knowledge, etc., etc. That's what institutions like university labs and so on are for. They are epistemic institutions. That's just, there's much more in sociology, professions and so on, but that's classic. But I now will call sociology has to do with epistemic institutions. They are there to produce, reproduce, normalize, test, and so, or reject or attack knowledge shared in epistemic communities. Anthropology, since we are so close to anthropology here, what is relevant for the knowledge of anthropology? Of course, there's a long history of cognitive anthropology. And cognitive anthropology has to do not just with knowledge, but with knowledges in different cultures. Now, if I define knowledge as beliefs shared in an epistemic community, what anthropology is all about is different kind of communities in the world have different kind of criteria of what for them is knowledge or not. So if you have criteria here in Russia or here in St. Petersburg and you do fieldwork, for example, in the Amazon River, they may have different kind of epistemic criteria. What they call knowledge, we may call just beliefs or false beliefs or superstition. All right? So it depends where you are and so how you call this knowledge. Now, anthropology is one of the ways to study variations of knowledge criteria across the world. And to finish in more detail, to stop, and then we have debate. Linguistics. As I said, most of the knowledge about the world we get through text and talk, through language use. That's how we know knowledge. Now, those of you who are from linguistics have heard a little bit, not much, about how knowledge affects language. Most of you have heard of, for example, the analysis of sentences in terms of topic and focus, sometimes called topic and comment, or theme and rhyme. It comes from functional linguistics in Czechoslovakia and then also in the United States. Today is classical linguistics. Classical linguistics says that the structure of a sentence, you have a part which is already known or better known or given, and many words used for the same kind of thing, which we call a topic. What you talk about, you say you have a story about Mary, and you say something new about Mary, and Mary is already known to the person you talk to, so Mary is known, and then you say, Mary is going to come for dinner tonight. And the new information that Mary is coming to dinner tonight, you call the focus. It is the new information in the structure of the sentence. So there is some kind of binary relationship between things which are already known or better known or just talked about and so on the one hand, and things which somehow are new. That's a very classical idea of linguistics. You know, that structure of sentences. Not only that. Another thing we know already in linguistics is the following, namely that many languages, especially indigenous languages, they mark in the verb morphology itself how you knew. So if I say to my friend at home, for example, Mary is coming to dinner tonight, in some languages you cannot simply say Mary is coming to dinner. In English or Russian you would say Mary told me that she is coming to dinner tonight. That's how I knew, you know, through discourse. Or for example, in many languages you have to show how you knew. For example, you know because you have seen it, or because you have heard it, or because you inferred it, or because she told you. So many languages in the verb morphology show where you got the knowledge from, and you call these things evidentials. In English and Russian and Spanish, it is explicit. You have to say, Mary told me that, or I've seen that, or I include that. You know, it is but in some languages, it is part of the verb itself. Another aspect of language and knowledge is the following, that you can modulate how sure you are. You cannot only say, Mary is coming to dinner tonight, but you can say, maybe Mary is coming tonight. And it is maybe, it's not sure. So you use modal expressions, modal adverbs, and so on in English and many other languages, which somehow show how sure you are. All right? And another notion in linguistics which is very important, and then it gets to where we are, namely that some of the information in text is implicit and some of the information is explicit. So the notion of presupposition, implication, and so on is something we can now explain in these terms. All these notions together are studied by people in linguistics and psycholinguistics in terms of what they call common ground. So the structure, the epistemic structure of sentences, discourses have to do with common ground, namely what I think you know. And that's what is the common ground? How do we know? Now, if I ask you from what I've said, how is common ground calculated in each moment? In the context model, you know, there's a knowledge device, a machine, and it calculates each second what I think you know. So now we know how common ground, which is a famous notion in psycholinguistics and linguistics, now we know how the knowledge machine in our head calculates at each moment, at each sentence, what is the common ground. We have at least three things. First, people know because they're a member of the same epistemic community. Therefore, you can presuppose many things. The second source of knowledge for common ground is what I told people yesterday. So, for example, I said, you remember this guy I told you about yesterday? It's not common ground for everyone in the epistemic community, but I told you, so you should know it. Common ground is also past communication. The third common ground is what happens in the context. If I say here, everyone knows here what it means. In this room, in this university, it is part of the context. The fourth part of common ground is what I just talked about, what the main topic is, namely the discourse of knowledge. This is the main topic of my lecture. So that's the fourth source of what you already know. And the last source of common ground is what? What I just said in the last sentence. So if you want to calculate what is new in a sentence, you have to look at 5 sources. General knowledge, what I told you last time, what is happening in this context, what happened in this text, and what happened in the last sentence. That is the 5 ways you calculate what is old and new in each sentence. Now, there are many other, and then we finish, because I like to have more questions from you. This is what linguistics has been doing so far. But there are many other aspects of discourse which are simply ignored in current linguistics, which also have to do with knowledge. For example, the study of metaphor. Metaphor has to do with mental models. Mental models which somehow are multimodal. So if I use a mental model, for example, analyzing the work in my work on racism, how people in the newspaper, in political discourse, speak about immigration, people say waves of immigrants. So I simply, as a joke, sometimes ask students, do you know how immigrants arrive in our country? And people say, well, by plane, by boat. They say, no, they arrive in waves. Immigrants always arrive in waves. Why is that so important? Not only because journalists love metaphors, but this particular kind of metaphor has to do with what? With mental models. A mental model is multimodal. It only not means many immigrants are coming, but a wave of water, large quantity of water. They also say avalanches, not those waves. It means that it's something embodied. It has to do, as you know from cognitive linguistics, it has to do with embodied experiences. So when you read every day in the newspaper that all these immigrants come in waves, how do you feel? Drowning. Literally drowning in immigrants. And that is indeed true. It's not just theory. When I did interviews in Holland and California and also in Latin America about immigration and minorities, people actually describe the situation in their neighborhood as drowning in all these immigrants. You know, this feeling of creating fear in society through the use of metaphors is quite important. So therefore, not only the metaphor of waves is being used, but also an invasion of immigrants. Again, something which creates fear, as if immigrants are a foreign army. So metaphors are very important in the creation of mental models. They make the situation very concrete. Something vague and abstract like immigration is translated into something which can create fear, namely a mental model. But many aspects of discourse I will just mention to finish, namely how you describe people. You can describe the situation, like for example the bombing in Boston, at many levels of discourse. You can say there was a bombing in Boston and not more, headline. But you can tell the same story also with lots of details. You know how people got hurt, how people missed their leg. I mean, I read a story of someone who described what happened, and he said there were legs flying through the air. Very concrete, visual aspect of a mental model. That is what he or she remembered. All right? So you can describe events in very abstract general terms or in very concrete details. And you can give that particular detail of a leg flying through the air and many other details not. For example, the exact color of the clothes of the participant, is that relevant? No, it is also detailed, but that's not given. But the leg flying through the air is much more terrible. So you have at each level of description things which are more or less relevant. So the fact that you can describe persons and events in many, many ways, it has to do also with the relationship between a specific knowledge about an event, a mental model, and how you describe the event in a specific situation in a newspaper or an everyday story. And many other things, implications, presuppositions, many aspects of discourse you can only explain and describe when you know about mental models, relationship between mental models and generic information, and the relationship between mental models and ideologies, which I'm not talking about today. That mental models are not only controlled by the text and not only by your generic knowledge, but also by ideologies you have about terrorists, for example. Maybe if it was, we don't know which group it was, they will not say that it is a terrorist attack. They will say that it is an act of resistance. Same event, different interpretation. Why? Because there is a different ideological basis for the description of the event. Someone who planted the bomb may not call it a terrorist attack, but something totally different. Why? Because at the basis of the mental model is not generic knowledge, but also an ideology which controls the structure and the evaluation in the mental model. Now there's much more, but now I would like to hear you. Thank you. Questions, critique. What should I explain more? I'm afraid that ja nie poнимаю по-русски. So you have to speak in English or French or Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch or German or any Western European languages except from Basque and some others. But the major languages you can try out with me, except Eastern European languages. I'm sorry. I had 1 year of Russian in my first year of study many years ago. So I have some words, but I cannot understand it. So you have to speak in English or another Western European language. Go ahead. Пожалуйста.
Спасибо. I'll try to speak English. So I have 3 questions. Let's start with one. When you talk about a text presenting some event in the world, like the Boston bombing, for instance, do you mean just a sounding text, or do you also mean a TV picture, for instance? Because when you have the text accompanying the picture, or the other way around, if you wish, the picture accompanying the text, what part of the mental picture is transferred by words, and what part of the context or whatever is conveyed by the picture?
Right.
So that's one.
Shall I first answer that?
Yes.
Very easy. Today, discourse analysis is multimodal. Today, in many disciplines of discourse analysis, we do not only see discourse as text or talk, verbal, but it is also images, sounds, figures, gestures, colors. So today, discourse analysis is not limited to verbal structures, but also other semiotic structures, as you like, and many people today do this. So if people form a mental model of what happened in Boston, they not only get it from text in a newspaper or on the internet or whatever, but also they see maybe pictures on the internet or on television, and they construe a mental model, especially the visual aspects of the mental model, also with this information. So that is also why a mental model is multimodal. It is not only construed knowledge about the world, etc., etc. People who have been to Boston will construe or evocate, for example, aspects of Boston. People who know the streets in Boston, and you know where Boylston Street is, where this bomb was exploding, they will have a visual aspect of you know, picturing Boylston Street and so on. So the mental model of a text is multimodal, and sometimes we only remember the visual information and not the text information. I give you one other proof. Sometimes you see a news item on television with images, and sometimes you see it in the news, or you read it in the newspaper. Very often the people don't remember whether they have seen it on television or whether they have read it on the newspaper. It means that the mental model is multimodal for both messages. So very often you don't know whether you have seen it on television or read it in newspaper, because what you remember is not a literal text or the literal images on television. What you remember is the mental model of what you're reading.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that with the developing of the TV or internet or whatever, we need less information about the context, because the information about the context is already there. It's accompanying the text. I don't have to know that bombs kill people if I'm shown the picture where people die. Okay. So does it mean that when we have this multi-channel kind of flow of information, the more diverse the sources of the information are, the less we need to know, to have a common knowledge?
I don't know, and actually I doubt it, because in the same way you can see that someone can die from a bomb explosion, you can simply say bomb explosion caused deaths, or after, in the text itself you can say after the bomb explosion there were 10 dead people. You don't need the visual expert to have it shown, and people have an idea what that means, and because they have seen car accidents they know what dead people look like from other sources. So I'm not sure. You need general knowledge for anything, also for the interpretation of pictures. Pictures are not from a child. You give them, you know, a picture of a bomb explosion, it doesn't mean that without language they understand what is happening. In the same way as you have to learn to understand verbal language, you have to learn to understand pictures. It's not like immediately. It's just another way of semiotic, of semiosis. All right, it has to be learned. So I don't think that the basis of knowledge will be different. What is true, and maybe there, but that requires more analysis, if with pictures you need less presuppositions. I don't know, because it is already there, but usually newspapers and so on practically never publish just a picture. A picture always needs a text. Pictures are not, let's say, non-ambiguous. They need interpretation too. So usually you cannot just do it with text, and you can with text communicate much information which is not ambiguous. But it's very difficult to communicate information with just a picture, because the pictures can be read in many, many ways. How, if you see people on the ground with lots of blood, how do you know it was caused by a bomb explosion, that it was in Boston, and so you don't know, because the picture don't show it.
Okay, then number 2, about waves of immigration.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right, of course, when you say that constant usage of this metaphor causes fear, causes frustration, okay. Is it deliberate? Is it using such a metaphor? Is it a deliberate, conscious action, or is it just the way the language is built? Is this additional fear, additional frustration just imprinted into the linguistic structure? Or is it every time just a conscious act of frightening people?
Yes and no. Some newspapers and some news outlets do this intentionally. They do it intentionally. Why? Because many years ago, I've been talking to journalists in many countries. And also in the country where I became to live 14 years ago in Spain, I had, when I already wrote about these things in the 1980s, I said, now you guys, now you get new information, why don't you avoid these particular kind of metaphors, because these have these and these functions. Although they knew that these functions were there, they started to use them anyway. Not because it's just practical or, no, because although they knew it, they will use them anyway. What I'm saying is not that much of the language and the metaphors people use in everyday life are not nearly automatized, but not only metaphors, many other words. For example, to call immigrants illegal when they don't have papers is also creating an idea that they are criminals. And this use of words have been criticized a lot. And when the newspaper continues to use the word anyway, I think it's like any kind of thing in everyday life. When you know that something is bad for other people and you continue to use it anyway, you are, even when you do it without reflection, you are at least guilty of negligence. It is like every other kind of thing. I mean, that's why people in buildings have these signs in the United States, slippery when wet. Why? Because people can fall, and if you don't take precautions and so on. And so the same thing with the use of words. I mean, if you use this metaphor and this particular kind of lexicon, you know that these conditions or these words may cause these particular kind of consequence. When you use them anyway, then even when you are not thinking about it, you are like in everyday life, when you don't think, you commit things which are reproachable. You are at least responsible for what you do. And you can simply, instead of waves, you can simply say, large group, etc. Or yesterday another, you know, you don't have to use the metaphor, but when you use it, you should be, and I think someone writing for millions of people, someone writing for millions of people, or speaking for millions of people like a politician, or someone who writes a textbook, someone who writes or speaks public discourse is responsible for each word they write, I think. Because it's like any other kind of act which can have negative consequences for the public. For example, making food with wrong ingredients, consumed by thousands or millions of people. You are responsible for everything you put in the food. And when it has consequences where they're negative, you can even go to court. Now, in the same way, if you produce a public text with different words or images or metaphors or implications or presuppositions and so on, you're responsible for what you write. And you better think about what you do. You can even go to court. And I think rightly so, because what you can cause is just think of 70 or 80 years ago, in the beginning of the Second World War, what was produced and said about Jews in Nazi Germany began also only as words, and then violence as consequences of words. Then think of the former Yugoslavia, and how suddenly people who always lived together, you know, like Muslims and Orthodox Christians, and suddenly because of all this public discourse against Muslims, not only was just words, but it had consequence, and suddenly they hated each other. How did it come? Because they were always lived together? No, they were natural consequences of these particular kind of discourses. So manipulation, mass media consequences are there. They have very real consequences, and therefore I think these particular kind of metaphors should be avoided. You should not be sent to jail, but if you don't do it better, you may maybe be fired because you're not doing a professional job, like any other thing. Third question.
I don't want to monopolize yours, so I'll wait with my third question.
Yes.
Thank you for the lecture. Very insightful. I just wonder whether you a little bit exaggerate the significance of discourse over meaning and reference, and I give an example.
What do you mean?
I'll give an example. It's going to be clear. For instance, the case of political correctness. And 50 years ago, People use, I can use it, I'm not in the US, so I can use it, the word Negro. Then it went over the books. So then blacks, then African American, poverty. So people try to, because of these dangerous metaphors and stuff like that. But the racism didn't do this. So the new words, the new metaphors, just acquired the properties of the old one, and that's why I'm saying that the meanings, the reference, the actual blacks, they still convey some meaning, and whatever we call them, in some time, it's going to be racist and not politically correct.
Right.
Did you understand?
I understand what you're saying. First of all, they're not metaphors. They're just denominations, but it doesn't matter. I mean, what you got? Words. Yeah. Words to call people in such and such a way. There's a long debate about that, of course, and each time we have a new debate from Negroes to blacks and Negro, Afro-Americans to African-Americans, with or without a dash, and so on. So there are many, many ways to do this. I think that there are, the ways you describe lexically people is not arbitrary. So I think there is a very good rule of, let's say, pragmatic appropriateness, that you use the word the people themselves prefer to use. All right? So if African Americans want to be called African Americans, I think that is for sociolinguistics or ethical reasons or political reasons, that is the adequate way to do. It doesn't mean that, therefore, using or not these words, the ethnic prejudices, the racist ideologies are going to change. But at least it shows that we are aware that they have some kind of power. Not how we decide to call them, Negroes, but how they think we should call them. It has to do with a linguistic, a sociolinguistic manifestation of equality. It has to do with decency. It has to do with rights. It has to do with, sociolinguistic rights. And even when people may have sometimes the same ethnic prejudices or racial prejudices, it at least shows that we are aware. In the same way, we no longer, like in the old days, could use names for women in this and this way. We now learn that certain kinds of things you simply don't say about women anymore. It has to do with gender equality. These fundamental things are very important. For example, in Dutch, in Russian, in Spanish and so on, for example, using diminutives to refer to women as they were less important, smaller, etc., very common. And you will stay have these things in everyday conversation. It doesn't mean anything. But if some man talks about his colleague who is a woman and also a professor in a diminutive, it simply sometimes implies that this other person is less important. So you learn not to do this anymore, and it has to do with kind of, of equality, linguistic decency, sociolinguistic norms and values, and many other aspects as well. Now, does this change does it change opinions? I think that if you don't read every day in everyday conversations that women or black people somehow are less important by the way you call them, it probably also evokes specific mental models and generalization of mental models in terms of attitudes and ideologies which are involved. I do think that when you show respect and equality in language, it also has an effect on mental models, and mental models are more general attitudes and ideologies. I definitely think so. Oh, yes.
Thanks.
Other questions? Yes, and then you, please.
Thank you for your lecture. I want to ask you about how media's influences on communicational situation. I don't mean video and sound and so on, but modes of representation of text itself.
Right.
Because I felt kind of lack in your conversation of such kind of aspect, maybe not in your books. So whether it is important, does text written or pronounced, written on paper or
spoken?
An aspect of pragmatics itself.
I'm not sure I understand what the question is. Your question, whether it's spoken or a written text?
No. Whether it influences on pragmatics in your sense, whether it is important as well as socio-linguistical context, as well as generic knowledge.
I still fail exactly to see what you... I said context has these properties, and it should be relatively simple, because otherwise we cannot manage it in fractions of seconds. Each moment we talk, we have to be appropriate. If we have to analyze many aspects of the communicative situation, we cannot be appropriate in fractions of seconds. It should be relatively simple. 5, 6, 7, as the psychology would call the magical number 7, plus or minus 2, an old article in the 1950s which says what we can handle in short-term memory. So there are not many things. Now, one of the things which I, true, in my books on context, are doubting about is, for example, whether or not the medium of communication, spoken or written, is part of the definition of the context. My decision, but it's just an arbitrary decision, is no, it's not part of the context, but part of the text. It is not context but text. Whether we speak or write has to do with the phonology or writing system. It is not context but text itself. So it is not whether or not a thing is more or less appropriate for you, me speaking professor, to you, student, or whatever your identity is, and so on and so on. But it has to do with one of the levels of speech in multimodal sense. So if you define text or talk in multimodal ways, it can mean just letters, it can mean sounds, it can be written things, it can also be gestures, it can be also images. For example, headlines of newspapers are also visually great, larger, on 2 or more columns, and so on and so on. So headlines, bigger letters, letter type, typography, position on the page, visual stuff. All these are aspects of a multimodal text. It doesn't have to do with the context of the text, but it has to do with the text itself in a multimodal definition. So it's not pragmatic appropriateness, but it is, let's say, semiotic correctness or semiotic aspect of text, I would say. All right?
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask about your concept of knowledge itself. You told that now you perceive knowledge to be more situational and more flexible, more contextual, that it should be relevant to the specific criteria of the epistemic community.
Yes.
What do you mean by these criteria? So how can we distinguish knowledge from some other types of, I don't know, mental models, or any mental model can be considered as a knowledge, or can we distinguish it from, again?
No, because you can have a mental model which is just your mental model of a situation, is your impression. I said there is also something, for example, which is your emotions, your opinions, and so if you say, I don't like this apple, or whatever, is that knowledge? No, it is something, your opinion about a specific situation. A mental model is personal, it's unique, it's just you. But as I said, knowledge is not only belief, your belief about something, but it's shared belief. All right, shared belief. And it's not only shared belief in an epistemic community, but it's also justified. So you say, this and this is true in our community because it satisfies these fundamental 3 criteria, which you can call the criteria of reliability. My belief is reliable when I have experienced it, seen it, observed it. So you go to court and you have seen a crime being committed, and the judge asks, or whomever asks, did you see this person? And you see, yes, I saw this person with my own eyes. That's it. That's some of the evidence of perception, of experience, and so on, and so on, and so on. And it's very strict. For example, if you usually wear spectacles and you come in court without spectacles, you know American movies like this, and then suddenly the person has to recognize someone and without the spectacles cannot do it. Okay, so it must be not just vision, but it must be reliable vision, all right? Or reliable hearing. or reliable touching, and so on. Reliable sense is one. So you have heard it, and people call it in court, it doesn't count, it's hearsay. What John told you is not relevant. But in some situation, what an expert told you, therefore you have expert witnesses in court, what an expert tells you, yes, is counted as true. Therefore, in a dissertation, you write, so-and-so showed that so-and-so. It is, you use an expert as a proof of what you say. You know, so reliable discourses are expert discourses and so on. And when you say, I know this because I can infer it, what you do is reliable inference. How you call this? Proof. Mathematical, logical, or any kind of reliable argumentation is, you know, a form of reliable inferences. This is what in any kind of epistemic community is true. Only in science, much more strict. For observation, you need microscope, telescopes, and other machines to observe things and to, you know, to record things and many other things as well. So that's science. But in everyday life, you know, you simply say, I saw it and that's good enough. So each epistemic community has its own criteria, and it changes by culture, by society, in history. It's dynamic. So you simply say, this knowledge is defined in terms of shared beliefs of an epistemic community and justified in each epistemic community by the epistemic criteria of each community. So it makes it essentially relative and essentially contextual. In one context you can say something which is true, and the same thing you can say in another context, and then it's wrong. It happens all the time. So, and I think this more natural way of talking about knowledge is much more interesting for epistemology than the rigid traditional way that it should be true forever. We don't have access to truth forever. We better use everyday notions. So yes, my theory is founded on a more naturalistic concept of knowledge. In the same way as we learn to speak about natural languages and not formal languages. And since Chomsky, not just grammars, but actual language use. You know, in sociolinguistics, pragmatics, conversation analysis, we talk about actual language use, not formal theories of correctness and grammaticality. So it's part of a general tendency to take more natural notions in our theories. Other questions? Go on.
Thank you for your lecture. And I just wanted to ask you if there are ways of using the theory that you described for understanding other types of knowledge. Let's say what you describe is a consensus knowledge, something very shared, understandable, I don't know, taken from the school and so on. So imposed in a way by different institutions, epistemic institutions.
Yeah.
But if there are some ideas, like for example in our post-Soviet situation that we had, that came without any significance and were used a lot in discourse, in newspapers, in talks, in whatever, like, I don't know, human rights, democracy, things like this. Yeah? They don't have any significance, any meaning, but they are used with the presumption that we have. We understand it. So this is not a consensus knowledge, but some kind of another knowledge. Or a different example would be, let's say, subversion. We have a consensus about something, about whatever, I don't know, an idea of sex, let's say. But there are proofs that this consensus is not so as rigid as we think about it.
Right.
There are subversive practices, ideas that we can also observe if we see them.
Okay.
And what is that?
Now, first of all, applying what I just replied to her is that there is not just one epistemic community, a universal one, but there are many. So you're a different kind of epistemic. What is true in your lab may not be true outside of the lab. What is true in your small epistemic community, what you know in St. Petersburg, they may not know in Moscow, and vice versa, and so on. So there are many epistemic communities, professional one, non-professional one, everyday ones. So already we have lots of variation by culture, by history, by country, and so on, where you have different kind of epistemic communities. Each with their own criteria. Usually they're the same kind of thing, but with different application. That's one thing. But the example you gave is not about knowledge, but about other things. It has to do with norms and values. It has to do with ideologies. It is not what we all think to be true, but it happens that because there are different groups, Soviets, let's say, and post-Soviets, with different norms and values and aims, it is not knowledge which is different. They may use different kinds of knowledges, for example, about the economy. Fair enough. So people who have different ideologies, for example, liberal, neoliberal, capitalistic, anti-capitalist, socialist, and so on, they have not only using different arguments based on different kinds of knowledge, for example, about state economy, whatever, on the one, that's knowledge which may be shared or not shared. But it is used for a specific different kind, not of knowledge, but another kind of social cognition, which I would call attitudes and ideologies, which are controlled not by knowledge criteria, but by norms and value, what is right or wrong. So democracy is not true or not true, that's silly. Democracy is not true or false. Democracy is wrong or right. And it is a different kind of thing. It is not a knowledge criterion, but it is an evaluation criterion. It has to do with norms and values, and we talk about ideologies. And ideologies are different for each group. So as long as you still have old-style communists here, it's a group which has still different kinds of norms and values from, for example, more a neoliberal capitalist or democratic way of seeing things. So yes, we are talking about social cognition all the time, but knowledge is part of an epistemic community, large or small. And within the epistemic community, you may have different groups with different kind of ideologies. Socialist, feminist, anti-feminist, racist, pacifist, militarist, and so you have all these different kind of groups which have different interests, different aims, different norms, different values. It has to do with power. It has to do with power differences. It has to do with domination. It has to do with resistance. It has to do with all the things you mentioned. These things, for me, are social cognition, but they are not knowledge. We have the system of social cognition is very complex. We have attitudes, for example, about abortion. Again, I read today in a newspaper, a Spanish newspaper on the internet, that the Minister of Justice is going to discuss again an old abortion law of 30 years ago. And we have maybe another regress, Catholic regress, to old system of maybe getting permission to have an abortion and so on and so on. Does it have to do with knowledge? No, it has to do with norms and values. So what you ask is fine, but it doesn't have to do with knowledge, although people using ideologies can use or abuse of knowledge and so on. That's why you have sometimes people who show the superiority of white people by doing specific kinds of tests of intelligence and so on. They use and abuse knowledge in favor of specific kinds of ideologies, but it's a different kind of thing.
But just one point, no?
Yes, okay.
So then what you're describing now, it means that knowledge applies only to so-called facts.
No, I didn't say that.
But this is what is coming from. This is how I...
That's an inference it's a wrong inference. It's a wrong inference. No, that's not what I said. Is what I said is not facts, because facts is something like independent of people. But this
is what you were describing. So
did I use the word facts?
No.
Did I use the word facts?
Okay,
I did not. What I said is what people call facts. Maybe I didn't say that. So it is something how they represent things and how for each kind of epistemic group something is the case or not. For them. You know, for them. So facts is something like independent of groups. You know, it's like here's a chair and that's independent of knowledge of the world and so on. Then I have to refer you to this famous book, already several years old, of John Searle about the social construction of reality. And you know, what I'm saying is that it's not a question of facts, but what, according to their own criteria, people in an epistemic community think for them to be true or not. And that is how I define. So it's relative to how people define it, and they may be wrong. So in the Middle Ages, they thought the earth was flat. For them, it was knowledge. Today, it's not knowledge, but just false belief.
This is not what I was saying. Of course, I understand that about facts and social construction. What I meant is that what you described looked like facts do exist. You know, like chair is a chair, and this is knowledge, and rest is ideology, and this is
right. But then I understand. But then we have, that's a different kind of talk. It's not about epistemology, but about ontology. And I'm not talking about ontology today. I mean, first of all, I'm not a philosopher. I'm just an ordinary discourse analyst.
Thank you very much for the talk. And if we could go back to the first and the second question, in different order though. First comment is about racism. Well, actually both of them. So the first one, don't you think it's a bit of a slippery slope to be so mindful about the ways that we can use to refer to people? Be more mindful, say, of the ways of the words we use to refer to black people, for instance. More mindful than of the ways we refer to other kinds of people.
Yeah.
And you know, mind you, of course, I do feel strong about equality, but I just feel like equality can also be somehow jeopardized by the fact that you narrow down the repertoire of ways you can refer to people, and of also of evaluations. It's almost like you can't evaluate them anymore, only because there's only so many ways you can,
I know what you're saying. Yeah.
If I could maybe share a story. So I'm sitting in a car with my two friends, they're both American, Greek Americans, husband and wife in their 50s. Very liberal, very well educated, all that.
Right.
And so it happens we're talking about men with a wife. And she's telling me, I've always found that I don't know, she's saying something to the effect of, I've always found that Japanese men are more attractive than Chinese men, which is sort of racist to say, but still she's saying that. And so I go, well, yeah, and mind you, non-American, of course, but I go, I've always found that black men are very attractive, which I, thoroughly believe. And there's a silence all of a sudden. It's almost like I can't say that either.
I know what you mean, yeah.
And isn't it really ridiculous?
Right. You're from Australia?
No, from here.
From here. So, but you learned an Australian accent. That's nice. I know the argument. And I know the argument also from empirical research. Right. When I did fieldwork in Amsterdam and in California, people said in the different neighborhoods, you can say anything anymore. Right. This idea that they felt they were sort of restricted in the things they can talk about other people. I understand that. And I'm not saying that when you suddenly said that you like black men more than white men, that then no. I said if. If you say that, if then it means that no. I mean, first of all, I was talking about the responsibility of the symbolic elites which control public discourse. They have to know public discourse, not how you talk in a car with friends. That is just something different. So public discourse should somehow be considerate. It should be know that specific kinds of words and so can have so and so consequence. That's the first thing. Then another thing is, for example, people speaking in stereotypes in everyday life. We all know from movies in the United States that Jews and blacks and so on in New York, they talk horribly about each other. Yeah, exactly. So does this mean, no, they are aware of ethnic differences, they are aware of stereotypes, and they use, like also black kids among themselves, they use the N-word. They would use nigger among themselves, but they know very well They can use it, but in a situation, you might use it maybe as a white girl of a friend or so on. But if they know, and again, now comes the notion of context, so important. And so discourse is not just text, but also context. So in a situation where they know that a guy using the word nigger or another negative word, it means that in that situation, that particular word, yes, is racist. It depends on the context. So it's not objectively using this particular kind of word. Therefore, I think more and more that a good theory of discourse should not only be a theory of the words of text, but also very clearly of how it is used, by whom, in which situation, with what aim, and so on. So it's context. So whatever you say, it is not what you can say, it cannot say. It depends that you have to mind the context. No. You have to mind the context.
Right, but don't you think it's saying, you can't use this particular word, maybe in a broader context, is something like saying you can't call someone an idiot. What if you think they're an idiot? I mean, of course, you shouldn't say that because you shouldn't point to people.
Okay. Right, I understand what you're saying. You remember that in the beginning I said my whole talk has 3 dimensions: discourse, cognition, society. Now, if you say to something that he or she is an idiot, does it mean that you say so as member of a powerful group and so on? No, you said as an individual. So power has to do with group relations. It has to do with not you being more or less powerful. No, only when you speak as member of a powerful group. For example, you as a white girl talking in this way against, in a specific situation, black people in general, then I would say you're wrong because of these kind of things. Because you may, in this way, produce and reproduce racism in society. So, and if you say so in a private situation, people will get angry and will say that's racist. But if you are a journalist in front of a television microphone, and 1 million people are listening to you, and you say this kind of thing, then not only you're wrong, but you are contributing actively to the reproduction of racism in society. So all what you say is right if you only systematically analyze the context.
But
okay?
Am I racist if I say that I think black men are physically attractive?
First of all, wait a minute. I think not. I mean, I think, first of all, I've written about racism and discourse for more than 30 years. And I've never said or implied that people are racist or not racist, because that's not how I see it. We are not speaking about racist or not racist people. That would be very silly. You would have a society where you have non-racist people, the good ones, and racist people, the bad ones. Of course, it's not like that. So what I'm saying is you have racist practices. And one of the racist practices is not only not letting people in your country, neighborhood or house, or marrying in your etc., but it can be racist discourse. So what you can do, and anyone can do, people whether or not they are racist, is contribute or participate in racist practices. So if you do this thing, in certain kind of situations, you would engage in a racist practice. Does it mean that you therefore are a racist? That's not how I think. We usually call people racist when they intentionally and repeatedly, with this particular kind of aim, are using these particular kind of words. Then we use people, of a racist party and we call they are racist. But I'm not talking about racist people, but about racist practices. Maybe racist organizations, fair enough. But not, I'm interested in racist practices, and especially in the racist practice we call discourse. So we need a much more advanced analysis. And I have to admit that when I talk about racism, the worry not only of you, but of many other students is, am I a racist or not a racist? Don't worry about it. Other questions? If you can still. There is still here one question. By the way, if afterwards you have more questions, you can find my website, which is very easy to remember. It's simply discourses, plural, discourses.org. Discourses.org. And there you find my my email address, which is all very easy. It's just my name, Teun, T-E-U-N, @discourses.org, or my last name as one word, Van Dijk, in Dutch, Van Dijk, @discourses. And if you have questions, you can always write me, and I always reply to all my email. It costs me every day 3-4 hours, but that's what I do. You have a question? Yes?
Thank you. Just, I don't know if it's a short one to answer, but you have presented a very complex vision of knowledge and concept of knowledge with different sources of knowledge, and which is actually really close to mine, but the question occurs, and I'm facing it myself, what could be the methodology to empirically study knowledge considered at this level of complexity, contextualized and psychologically psychically embedded, so on and so forth. Is discourse analysis enough for that, or should it be accompanied with some other methods?
Well, we have many methods in many disciplines. I mean, the most obvious way to know what people have here, knowledge, is to ask them. Just ask them. So you have questions and answers, you have interviews, you have life histories, you have observation of what they do and don't do with this kind of knowledge, you have think aloud protocols, you have experimental situations, and you say how fast they reply to a specific kind of question in a machine, and the more they have this particular kind of knowledge, etc. So we know, for example, that in psychological tests about discourse comprehension, we know that people with more knowledge read it faster, know more replies, and many, many others. So in psychology, cognitive psychology, sociology, and discourse analysis, we have many methods, different independent methods, to somehow show what people know and don't know. And not only in the most explicit method is always text and talk. But it's not only that, you also can test the knowledge of people by see what they can do or not do. I mean, for example, how do you know that children know that fire is hot? Well, after once burning themselves, they don't do it again, you know. So how do they know? It's just by observing what they do and don't do. And that is experience, everyday experience. Most of this experience we have from, you know, anyway. Of course, many people commit the same stupidity all the time, but well, that's another question. So there are many methods to show what kind of knowledge people have. The only thing is, I mentioned a little bit about the structure of knowledge in our mind, brain, depends. We know a little bit about it, but basically we know very little about the organization of world knowledge in our mind and brain. We know that's probably organized, that we can very quickly activate what we need to know. But how it's exactly organized, there are some theories about this, but how this is exactly done and how is not of, probably most of it is here in prefrontal cortex, but we also know the visual aspects are there, language aspects there, and motor, you know. So we have now more and more neuropsychological ideas about how things might be organized, but it's still very general, very abstract, and extremely vague.
It's about single brain.
Yeah.
What about when they work together?
That's what we already mentioned about the car experience. If you have a concept of car, of driving one every day, you have obviously a different brain structure of your experience than someone who only walks in the street and is afraid of cars.
How do we relate them then?
Therefore, I think that the structure of knowledge is not. As it is shared in epistemic community, obviously it cannot be multimodal, because the experience of people are different. So therefore, I think that in order to study knowledge in an epistemic community, it should be shared. It should be something you can share. And feelings you cannot share as such. What you can share is information. You can just tell people how, so and so. So I think then I would use more language, which you can share, like you can share the language and you can share knowledge and you can share ideologies. How best to test them? Through language. And it's not circular because language is not only dependent on how you describe a situation, but it's also dependent on context. As we've seen with the racism example, the same word have a totally different implication in one context on another context. So it's not a circular idea that we can infer the structures of knowledge through language analysis and then explain language through the mental models behind it. So it's a different level of analysis. But it's a good way always, you know, with this kind of general theories, to ask about what are the methods you are using. And I think at this moment, the method we are using most efficiently is by doing very detailed systematic discourse analysis, which is not done by epistemologists, which is not done by psychologists only superficially, so what is not done by sociologists and only sometimes by anthropologists. So we have a task, very important task, to contribute to epistemic analysis through very detailed discourse analysis. I think there's a very good way to know what goes on there.
Have you tried to combine your way of analysis, discourse analysis, with those methods developed by others?
Yes, I mean, in the book with Walter Kintsch, you know, 30 years ago, and talking about mental models, it was not just what people say and what they express, but also by all kinds of other experiments. So there are other methods to do so. And when I talk about racism in the media and so on, I also do so through other methods than just discourse analysis. So in principle, whatever we have in anthropology, sociology, psychology, social psychology and linguistic are converging on specific things we now know about these things. But it's still very primitive. Very primitive what we know about knowledge. The knowledge about knowledge is still very primitive, I think. It's just approximate.
Thank you.
The number of questions just shows clearly that we should invite you for a course of lectures, hopefully next academic year. Any more questions?
One more, a small one.
The last one.
But two. But then it's it. You two and we don't talk about racism, okay?
We talk about meta-discourse, if you will.
About what?
A meta-discourse, like people talking, I guess.
Talking, yeah.
Now, because you mentioned your research, my question is rather specific. Did people show their own their awareness of all the ideologies that sort of worked on them and over them? And, you know, did you find that people explicitly say, this is how I think about it, this is how I refer to it, it must be because of the media, because of the... Right?
Yes, people have meta-discursive consciousness. Mm-hmm. People know the kinds of things, not only where they can think about in this way, but also the things they can say and not say, and it's dynamic. The best situation is maybe not even in studies of racism, but in studies of gender. Just look at gender linguistics and gender communication and the things you can now say in society about women and men and how you should describe it. It's very sensitive today. You cannot simply say anything anymore because people are very conscious about this. I mean, you can even not get a job when you describe it in a very specific way and so on. Maybe not yet here in St. Petersburg, depends, but in specific situations in the United States or maybe in the Netherlands, if you use these particular kind of words and people are aware of it, they know that in a specific context, specific kinds of things, you can no longer say in this way. So yes, there is, and this part of sociolinguistics, there is not only that people have knowledge about the situation and knowledge about context, they also have meta-sociolinguistic knowledge about the kinds of things you can say, who, to whom, when, and so on. They know, and which situation. So among your friends in the car, you can say many things, but you know that as soon as you have a job interview, you already have to be careful, and as soon as you have a television interview, you have to be very careful. Depends on the context. So yes, people do have this particular kind of, I haven't done this particular kind of study, but in my empirical work, I found it constantly that people talk about talk. Oh yes. Final question.
take you away from knowledge, if I may.
Depends.
You've mentioned that your recent book is interdisciplinary, and also you try to combine social, cognitive, and textual, discursive together, looking at every object that you analyze. Do you think that that would you recommend that strategy of actually keeping an awareness of always keeping awareness of cognitive and social and the textual for those of us who are at the early stages of their scientific career? Do you think this is a larger trend? Do you think that contemporary limits of different subjects are sustainable, or what do you think?
That is what my PhDs ask me every day. Logically, I mean, they also want to know that, I mean, they say when you have a degree in linguistics, how can we also know all these things about psychology and the social sciences and so on? I'm talking here now about scientific research in general, obviously. And I'm saying is that what we have learned in linguistics and other social sciences is that if you only limit yourself to pure linguistic analysis, like in the 60s, just look at syntax. We learned that in order to even to know about syntax, you have to step outside of syntax and look at semantics, and then you know more about syntax. Or the same with phonology and so on. And once we stepped out of grammar and started to do pragmatics in the end of the 60s with Searle and many others, Grice and so on, for 30, 40 years, we knew now that we should not only study language in an abstract way, but in a more natural way, and then pragmatics and sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics come in, and in a natural way linguistics got sort of extended, and it was still linguistics. But we now know, and not only in cognitive linguistics, but in many other things, in order to understand even the things we are interested in, like maybe syntactic structures. I'm now talking as a linguist. And even semantic structures, and even things like discourse coherence. My first work on these kind of things in the 1970s, I was still had this idea that you can define things like discourse coherence in purely linguistic terms. I remember I studied in Paris with structural linguists like Grémas in French. And they had this idea that discourse had to do with isotopy. You know, you have the same kind of meaning elements in sentences, and that's what looked very fashionable and very advanced and so on and so on. Only we found out later that it was wrong. And it was wrong because that is not how discourse coherence works. But we needed something which is outside of language, namely how people represent situations. And there is no way in linguistics you can formulate something, how do people represent situations? There's nothing like that. But then we went to psychology, and 10 years, 15 years later, psychologists and we found out that it's not just that, but you need something else, namely mental models. And then suddenly, with this new notion, we could explain things not only about discourse coherence, but about many other things, namely how people memorize text, how they have, we could suddenly, with this notion, explain many, many things more. So, and then we got psychologists. And then we found out that the structure of these mental models not only depend on what people know about the world, but it also has to do with the social situation, what members of what groups are, that people are in the same situation, have a different mental model, whether they are a man or a woman, or to the left or to the right, or feminist or non-feminist. It also depends on ideology and has to do with groups and interests and power. And suddenly we know that in order to do it right, we need to go even further. And now, it's not even in the book. Now I am finding out that the fundamental structure of mental models is not only things which have to do with the mind or with the brain, but it probably has a very long source of evolution. It has to do with the people in a fraction of a second analyzing the environment. So if you are being attacked by a tiger, you have no half an hour to analyze the situation. You have to do it in fractions of seconds. How can you do it? You can do it only when you reduce all these megabytes and terabytes of information around you in the essential thing you have to know. And I think that the basic categories of analyzing a situation have to do with our evolution as humans of, in a significant and relevant way, analyze the situation in which you are. And that explains why the mental schema of mental models are always more or less the same. And then when you do that, suddenly you can explain many other things. Why is it that the structure of a mental model also shows up in the basic structure of sentences? If you think of, if you are a linguist, for example, and you know about case grammar, Fillmore, 60s, suddenly these categories of semantics are the same categories you find in the structure of a mental model. So suddenly you have not only just by coincidence a relationship between sentence structure and mental models, but the mental models are probably something which come from way, way, way back. You know? And then you can say, what I now explained to you, if I had in a class for a whole semester, and I can go into these details, you don't have to be a psychologist and a sociologist and anthropologist to know all these kind of things. Many of the things, instead of going to depth and learn everything about phonology and nothing else, you can also specialize not in depth, but you can specialize in this way. You can say, now, with these notions in linguistics and in epistemology and in sociology and in psychology, I suddenly can explain things which before I could not describe. So I would say, you don't have to worry as a PhD that you don't have all this knowledge of disciplines, because we simply know that when you know one discipline very, very well, that your explanations are very, very limited. You may go a long way, like Chomsky did. You may go a very long way in psychology and just have a narrow mind. But you always will find that your analyses are very limited. A good example is also computer science, artificial intelligence. They were just looking at specific kinds of things, and it simply did not work. So we have to know many more things, and I think even when you have only 3 or 4 years for a PhD, you can learn many things in your own field of specialization. And you don't have to know everything of all these disciplines, but only the things which are relevant. So you don't have to know all these disciplines, but what I do think is that you have to try to relate different kinds of things, and it always has to do with the aims of your research. Some of these aims, if you're only interested in phonological variation, you may not need all these kind of things, but for many other things which are for me more interesting, like how is racism produced in society, you cannot do it without a detailed analysis of racist discourse and ideologies, without a detailed analysis of ethnic prejudices in the mind, and without a detailed analysis of the role of ethnic prejudices and racist discourse in the production of power and domination in society. You need these 3 elements. It depends on the questions you ask. For many of these questions, you need these 3 dimensions. That's what I think. And you can learn many of them within 1 year. So there is still hope.
See, things are not so bad as they may seem. After this impressive lecture, and especially after the debate, I have a strong feeling that Professor van Dijk and the audience belong to one and the same epistemic community. And I do hope that we will be able to invite you for a short course next year, that we have construed a solid, common ground for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.